All right, so, you know, uh, becoming fluent in English is something that I think we all kind of struggle with. And
Yeah.
we're going to unpack some wisdom from this YouTube masterclass. And it
Mm.
features a panel of language experts.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and what I love about this one is they actually don't just talk theory. They get into the like nitty-gritty, like their personal journeys, the techniques that actually worked for them, and even like, those moments where it felt like they were hitting a wall.
Yeah. I think it's refreshing to see experts acknowledging that, fluency isn't this magical end state you just reach overnight.
Right.
It's an ongoing process,
Totally.
and it's got its own ups and downs. And these experts really don't shy away from that.
Yeah, and one of the things that they address head on is that fear of speaking,
Right.
which I think like a lot of us can relate to.
Absolutely.
Have you ever noticed how your brain just like freezes up
Oh, yeah.
when you're trying to speak in another language, even if you know you have the vocabulary and grammar down?
Right. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's like stage fright, but for everyday conversations.
Right.
One of the experts even shared this anecdote about completely blanking on the phrase, "Are you ready?" in Serbian,
Oh, wow.
even though he'd been studying it for 2 years.
Wow.
So it just shows you how nerves can get to anyone, regardless of their experience level.
That's so reassuring in a weird way, right? Like,
Yeah.
even if you're a polyglot, you're not immune to like a good old-fashioned brain freeze.
Right.
So how do these experts recommend dealing with that fear?
Well, one concept that really stood out to me was this idea of the Goldilocks zone,
Okay.
which is all about finding the right level of challenge for your current stage of learning.
I see.
It's like you wouldn't jump into the deep end of the pool if you're just learning to swim, right?
Right.
You'd start in the shallow end and gradually work your way up.
So instead of throwing yourself into a conversation with like a group of native speakers at a crowded bar,
Right.
maybe start with something a little less intimidating, like practicing with a language exchange partner online.
Exactly. It's about setting yourself up for success by choosing situations that challenge you just enough
Mm-hmm.
to push you out of your comfort zone, but without completely overwhelming you.
Yeah.
The key takeaway here is to be mindful of your own learning pace
Right.
and adjust that difficulty level accordingly.
It's about being strategic, right? Because if you constantly push yourself too far, you're just going to risk getting frustrated and giving up.
Right.
But if you always play it safe, you might not make as much progress.
That's the balance they're talking about.
Right.
And what I found interesting is they didn't just stop at find your zone.
Okay.
They actually offered tactics for figuring out where that sweet spot is for you at this moment.
Okay. I'm all ears. What are some of the strategies they recommend?
Well, one thing they emphasized was paying attention to your emotional state during practice.
Okay.
So if you're feeling constantly anxious or overwhelmed, that's a sign that maybe you're pushing yourself too hard. Dial it back a bit. Maybe focus on activities that feel more comfortable and build your confidence from there.
So it's about being self-aware and recognizing those signs of stress.
Right.
What about the other end of the spectrum,
Right.
where things feel too easy and you're not really being challenged?
That's when it's time to step things up a notch.
Okay.
Maybe try having a conversation with a native speaker
Mm-hmm.
on a topic you're really passionate about, or challenge yourself to read a book in English that's slightly above your current reading level.
Right.
The idea is to constantly nudge yourself a little bit further, but always stay within that zone where you feel challenged but not completely overwhelmed.
I love that it's like a personalized approach to language learning.
Yeah.
You're not just following a set curriculum.
Right.
You're actively adjusting the difficulty level
Right.
based on your own needs and your own progress.
Exactly.
And this brings us to another key theme that emerged from the masterclass, the importance of reframing mistakes.
Yes, this is where those personal stories really came into play. Several experts spoke about how they used to be terrified of making mistakes,
Right.
but they eventually realized that those mistakes were actually their greatest teachers.
Interesting.
They'd even go so far as to intentionally make mistakes just to see what they could learn from them.
That's so interesting. Can you elaborate on what they meant by intentionally making mistakes?
Well, one expert shared that when he was learning Spanish, he would deliberately use incorrect verb tenses
Oh, wow.
or gender agreements just to see how native speakers would react.
Interesting.
And he found that most people were very understanding and would gently correct him, which helped him to learn those rules more quickly.
It's like turning those potentially embarrassing situations into like valuable learning experiences.
Exactly.
I imagine that takes a lot of courage, though.
It definitely does. But the experts all agreed that it's crucial to shift our perspective on mistakes.
Right.
Instead of seeing them as failures, we need to view them as stepping stones to fluency. It's all about embracing that growth mindset and recognizing that we actually learn more from our mistakes than from our successes.
And one of the experts actually had a great tip for putting this into practice.
Oh, yeah?
He suggested that we think about how we react when someone's learning our native language.
Right.
We're usually much more forgiving and understanding, right?
Of course.
We don't expect them to be perfect, and we're often impressed by their effort to communicate.
That's such a powerful point.
Right.
It's like we have this double standard where we're way harder on ourselves
Right.
than we are on other people.
Totally. So the next time you catch yourself cringing over a mistake,
Yeah.
try to channel that same patience and understanding that you would extend to someone else in your position.
Right.
Right? It's about giving ourselves the same grace and encouragement that we would offer to another learner.
Absolutely.
Now let's talk about some practical techniques aside from embracing mistakes and finding our Goldilocks zone. What specific strategies did these experts use to actually improve their speaking?
One that came up repeatedly was something they called speak to yourself.
Wait, speak to
It
yourself.
sounds a bit... And another technique they highlighted that's really effective for improving pronunciation is called shadowing.
Okay, let's unpack that one. I've heard of shadowing,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure I fully understand how it works.
So shadowing is basically mimicking a native speaker as closely as possible.
Okay.
You choose like a short audio or video clip, something that you find engaging and that has really clear audio quality.
Okay.
And you basically try to repeat everything the speaker says,
Oh, I see.
matching their intonation, their rhythm, their pronunciation
Wow.
as precisely as you can.
It's like you're their vocal double.
Exactly.
It sounds like a great way to not just work on pronunciation, but to actually get a feel for like the natural flow of the language.
Exactly. It's like a workout for your tongue and your ears.
Mm-hmm.
You're training yourself to actually hear those subtle nuances of pronunciation and then replicate them in your own speech.
What kind of materials do the experts recommend using for shadowing?
Well, they stress that it's important to choose something that you genuinely enjoy listening to.
Yeah.
It could be a TED Talk on a topic that fascinates you.
Yeah.
It could be a scene from your favorite movie. It could even be a podcast episode on a subject you're passionate about.
The key is to make it enjoyable, right?
Exactly.
Because the more you enjoy the material, the more likely you are to stick with it.
Precisely. And one of the experts had this really interesting tip for choosing shadowing material.
Okay.
He suggested focusing on specific sounds that you find challenging in English.
Interesting.
So, for example, if you struggle with the R sound, you could choose a clip that features that sound prominently.
So you're basically creating a targeted pronunciation workout.
Exactly.
I like that. And speaking of targeting specific areas, one of the experts mentioned that AI tools like ChatGPT can be really helpful for generating practice materials.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Right.
Imagine using ChatGPT to create a list of words that all feature that tricky R sound.
Right.
It's like having a personalized pronunciation coach at your fingertips.
It's amazing how technology can be harnessed to support language learning in such creative ways.
Right, and it's just the beginning.
Yeah.
I can't wait to see how these AI tools continue to evolve and really transform the way we learn languages.
Me too. This is just the tip of the iceberg.
Speaking of extending our horizons,
Yeah.
what about vocabulary?
Yeah.
Did the experts offer any specific tips for building up our word bank?
They sure did. And one of them shared a technique that's surprisingly simple, but really effective.
Okay.
He talked about writing new words and phrases on sticky notes and then placing them around his house so he would see them throughout the day.
I love that.
Right? He'd put them on the mirror, the fridge, even the bathroom door.
Yeah.
The idea is to constantly expose yourself to the new vocabulary, even when you're not actively studying.
It's about making those new words a part of your daily life.
Right.
Another expert suggested using flashcards, but not in the traditional way.
Okay.
He recommended creating flashcards with full sentences
Oh, interesting.
instead of just individual words. So instead of just having a flashcard that says happy, you might have one that says, I'm feeling happy today because the sun is shining.
I see. So it helps you actually use it in context,
Exactly.
which is much more helpful than just memorizing its definition.
Exactly. And he also emphasized the importance of building both active and passive vocabulary.
Okay.
Active vocabulary is what you can readily use in speaking and writing,
Right.
while passive vocabulary is what you understand when you hear or read it.
That makes sense. It's like the difference between recognizing a word
Yeah.
and actually being able to use it in a sentence.
Precisely. And both types of vocabulary are essential for fluency.
Right.
Passive vocabulary provides that foundation,
Right.
while active vocabulary allows you to actually communicate.
So we've talked about embracing mistakes, finding our Goldilocks zone, the speak to yourself technique, shadowing, and some clever strategies for expanding our vocabulary.
Hmm.
What other insights did these experts offer on the path to fluency?
Well, one theme that emerged throughout the masterclass was the importance of finding genuine joy
Okay.
in the learning process, even in those inevitable moments of frustration.
Let's dive into that. How do we shift our mindset from seeing language learning as a chore to experiencing it as something enjoyable?
One expert shared a quote that really resonated with me.
Okay.
He said, "Think about the joy of learning instead of I have to do this."
I love that it's a subtle shift in perspective, but
Yeah.
it can make all the difference.
Exactly. And it's all about finding ways to make language learning fun and engaging.
Right.
One expert suggested connecting your English learning to a passion.
Okay.
It could be music, movies, travel.
Yeah.
Whatever sparks your interest.
So if you love music, you could listen to English songs and try to sing along.
Exactly.
Or if you're a movie buff, you could watch your favorite films in English with subtitles.
Exactly. The idea is to integrate language learning into activities you already enjoy, so it feels less like work and more like play.
That's such a great point. It's about making English a part of your world, not just a subject you study.
Absolutely. And this brings us to another important aspect of language learning, that the experts emphasize the power of context and immersion.
Let's unpack that. What do they mean by context and immersion?
Well, one expert shared that his most significant fluency breakthroughs happened when he had a romantic partner or flatmates who spoke English.
It's amazing how those real-life situations can accelerate learning.
Right.
When you're forced to use the language to communicate, it just clicks differently.
Right. And even if you don't have that kind of immersive environment, you can still create opportunities for authentic communication.
Right.
There are online language exchange platforms,
Yeah.
conversation groups, and even virtual reality experiences that can help you to practice speaking English in a more natural and engaging way.
So even if you can't travel to an English-speaking country, you can still find ways to bring the language to life.
Absolutely. And the experts all agreed that the more you can immerse yourself in the culture of the language,
Yeah.
the more deeply you'll understand it,
Yeah.
and the more motivated you'll be to continue learning.
It's like that saying language is the doorway to another culture.
Exactly. By learning a language, we're not just learning words and grammar rules.
Right.
We're gaining access to a whole new world of perspectives, experiences, and connections.
This has been so insightful. I'm already feeling inspired to level up my own English game.
Oh, that's great.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more crucial aspect that the experts emphasize,
Right.
the importance of personalized planning for consistent progress.
You mean not just going with the flow,
Yeah.
but actually having a strategy?
Exactly. One of the experts gave a really practical piece of advice. He recommended creating a concrete plan for the next 2 weeks,
Okay.
detailing specific days, times, and activities
Oh, wow.
to avoid procrastination.
I love that.
Right? It's like scheduling a workout or a doctor's appointment.
Mhm.
If it's in your calendar, you're more likely to follow through.
Absolutely. And the experts suggested focusing on specific goals like mastering a particular sound or grammar rule,
Right.
or dedicating a certain amount of time each day to reading or listening to English.
It's about breaking down those big, overwhelming goals into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Exactly. And by creating a personalized plan that works for you, you're taking ownership of your language learning journey and setting yourself up for success.
This is all such great advice. I'm feeling so motivated to get started.
That's awesome.
But before we move on to part 2, I want to leave our listeners with a little food for thought.
Okay.
What do you think, though? Ready for a bit of a challenge?
I'm intrigued. What thought-provoking question are you going to leave them with?
Here's what I'm thinking. What one specific action will you take this week to bring more joy and intention to your English practice?
That's brilliant.
Right.
It encourages listeners to actually apply what they've learned.
Yeah.
And to take that first step toward achieving their fluency goals.
Exactly. So until next time, happy language learning, and remember, every small step counts.
Absolutely. Picking up on that idea of taking action,
Yeah.
one of the experts actually had this really interesting perspective on overcoming the fear of speaking. He actually challenged himself to make at least one mistake every time he spoke English.
Wait, he intentionally tried to make mistakes?
Yeah.
I've never thought about it that way. How did that help him?
Well, he realized that by constantly striving for perfection,
Right.
he was actually paralyzing himself.
Yeah.
The fear of making a mistake was preventing him from speaking at all.
Oh.
So by giving himself permission to make mistakes, he took the pressure off and just allowed himself to focus on simply communicating.
That's such a clever approach. It's like he turned mistakes into a game, a
Yeah.
way to learn and grow.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of shifting our perspective on language learning. Instead of seeing it as this high-stakes test that we have to pass,
Right.
we need to approach it with more of a sense of curiosity and playfulness.
I love that. It reminds me of when we were kids, like learning to ride a bike or draw a picture. We weren't afraid to experiment and make mistakes. We just wanted to have fun and see what we could create.
That's such a great analogy.
Right.
And just like with those childhood experiences, the more we experiment and play with language,
Yeah.
the more natural and intuitive it becomes. One of the experts even compared language learning to working out at the gym.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this gym analogy.
So just like when you're working out, consistency is key in language learning.
Yeah.
You wouldn't expect to see results by going to the gym once a month, right?
Definitely not. You have to show up regularly and put in the effort.
Exactly.
It's about building those language muscles over time.
Exactly. And just like with physical exercise, it's about finding a routine that works for you
Right.
and gradually increasing the intensity as you get stronger.
Yeah.
One of the experts suggested starting with small, achievable goals, like learning a few new words each day
Yeah.
or listening to a short podcast in English.
It's those small wins that keep us motivated, right? Each step forward, no matter how small, builds momentum and helps us to stay on track.
Absolutely. And celebrating those small victories is so important.
Yes.
It reinforces those positive feelings associated with language learning
Yeah.
and makes the journey more enjoyable.
That makes sense. It's like rewarding ourselves for our efforts,
Yeah,
which helps to keep us engaged and motivated.
right.
So we've talked about the importance of consistent effort and celebrating those small victories, but what about those times when we hit a plateau or feel stuck?
Yeah.
What advice did the experts offer for breaking through those ruts and staying motivated over the long haul?
One of the experts who happens to be a polyglot and has learned multiple languages
Wow.
shared a technique that he calls spicing things up.
Spicing things up. I like that.
And he found that when he hit a wall with a particular language, it was often because his learning routine had become kind of stale and predictable.
I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah.
It's easy to fall into a rut, especially when you're studying on your own. So how do we spice things up? What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, it could be something as simple as trying a new language learning app, watching a movie in English with subtitles,
Yeah.
or even just changing the time of day that you usually study.
Oh, okay.
The key is to break free from autopilot and introduce some novelty and excitement back into your routine.
That's a great reminder. It's so easy to get stuck in our ways,
Yeah,
but sometimes a little change can make all the difference.
absolutely.
And this reminds me of something else that we touched on earlier, the idea of connecting your learning to your passions.
Yes, that's such a powerful strategy for staying motivated.
Right.
When you're genuinely interested in what you're learning, it doesn't feel like work.
Yeah.
One expert talked about how he would immerse himself in the culture of the language that he was learning, watching movies, listening to music, even trying to cook traditional dishes.
Wow. It's like you're not just learning the language, you're experiencing it.
Exactly. And he found that this kind of holistic approach not only made the learning process more enjoyable,
Right. Yeah.
but it also helped him to understand the nuances of the language more deeply.
It's like the difference between reading about a place
Yeah,
and actually traveling there.
exactly.
You gain a whole new level of understanding when you experience something firsthand.
Precisely. And this brings us to another crucial aspect of language learning that the experts emphasized,
Okay.
the importance of input.
Okay, let's break that down. What exactly do we mean by input in this context?
Input refers to the language that you're exposed to,
Okay.
whether it's through reading, listening, or watching.
Right.
The experts stress that consistent high-quality input is essential for language acquisition.
I see.
It's like feeding your brain a steady diet of your target language, which helps to expand your vocabulary, improve your grammar, and develop a more natural feel for the language.
So it's like immersing yourself in the language as much as possible, even if you're not actively speaking it yet.
Exactly. One expert suggested listening to podcasts or audiobooks in English while commuting, cooking, or even working out.
I do that.
Yeah. It's about turning those everyday activities into opportunities to passively absorb the language.
I love that it's like sneaking in extra practice without even realizing it.
Yeah.
What other tips did they have for maximizing our input?
One expert talked about a technique he used to call active listening.
Active listening.
So instead of just passively listening to English,
Okay.
he would actively engage with the material
I see.
by taking notes, summarizing key points,
Mhm.
and even trying to anticipate what the speaker would say next.
That's a great way to stay focused and really absorb the information. It's
Exactly.
easy to zone out when you're just passively listening,
Right.
but actively engaging with the material forces you to pay attention and process the language more deeply.
Absolutely. And it highlights the importance of being an active participant in your own learning.
Right.
Language acquisition isn't a spectator sport.
Yeah.
It requires your full engagement and attention.
Yeah. So true. It's not enough to just go through the motions. You have to be mentally present and actively participate in the process.
Exactly.
This reminds me of another technique that one of the experts mentioned, diary writing.
Ah, yes, diary writing.
Right.
That's a fantastic way to incorporate writing into your language learning routine.
Yeah.
And you know what's great about it? You don't have to worry about being grammatically perfect
Yeah.
or impressing anyone.
Right.
It's your own personal space to experiment with the language,
Mm.
make mistakes, and track your progress over time.
I love that it's like giving yourself permission to play with the language without judgment.
Exactly.
It's about getting those thoughts and ideas out of your head and onto the page, even if they're not perfectly formed yet.
Exactly. And over time, you'll start to notice patterns in your writing,
Right.
identify areas where you need to improve,
Yeah.
and gain more confidence in your ability to express yourself in English.
That's such a valuable insight. It's not about being perfect.
Right.
It's about using writing as a tool for exploration and growth.
Absolutely.
So we've covered a lot of ground today, from embracing mistakes to finding joy in the learning process to the importance of consistent input and active engagement.
Mm-hmm.
What are some key takeaways that you hope listeners will walk away with from this part of our deep dive?
Well, I think the main message that resonated with me from these experts
Yeah.
is that fluency is not about achieving some unattainable level of perfection,
Right.
but about embracing the messy, nonlinear, and ultimately human journey of language acquisition.
Yeah.
It's about finding what works for you, being kind to yourself along the way, and most importantly, finding joy in the process of learning and growth.
Beautifully said. It's about shifting our perspective from seeing language learning as a chore to viewing it as an opportunity for personal enrichment and connection. It's about opening ourselves up to new cultures, new
Right.
perspectives, and a whole new world of possibilities.
Absolutely. And remember, every single person who has achieved fluency in a language started from scratch.
Wow.
They were all beginners at some point,
Yeah.
grappling with new sounds, new grammar rules,
Right.
and the inevitable fear of making mistakes.
Yeah.
But they persevered, they embraced the challenges,
Yeah.
and they ultimately reaped the rewards of their hard work and dedication.
That's such an important reminder. It's easy to get discouraged when we compare ourselves to others,
Right.
but everyone's language learning journey is unique.
Yeah.
It's not about being the fastest or the most talented.
Yeah.
It's about showing up consistently, putting in the effort, and celebrating your own personal milestones along the way.
Right. And speaking of celebrating milestones,
Yes.
I think it's time for us to take a little break
Okay.
and come back refreshed for the final part of our deep dive.
I agree. I'm excited to see what other insights these experts have to share. Stay tuned for part 3. Okay, so one of the things that really struck me about these language experts was
Yeah.
like their emphasis on mindset.
Mindset.
They talked about it almost more than
Yeah.
specific techniques or strategies.
You're right. It's like having the right attitude is the foundation for everything else.
Yeah.
You know, one of the experts had this great analogy. He said, if you want to get strong, do push-ups.
I love that. So simple, but so true.
Right.
But how does that apply to language learning?
Yeah.
Are we talking about like metaphorical language push-ups here?
Exactly. It's about being proactive
Yeah.
and taking ownership of your learning.
Okay.
Don't wait for the perfect moment or for someone to give you permission.
Right.
Just start doing those language push-ups every day,
I see.
even if they're small at first.
So it's about taking action consistently, even if it's just like small steps at a time.
Yes. One expert recommended scheduling regular English time in your calendar,
Oh, wow.
just like you would a meeting or a doctor's appointment.
That's a great idea. It's easy to let language learning slip down our priority list.
Right.
But if it's actually scheduled in, we're more likely to make time for it.
Exactly. Another expert talked about setting specific goals
Okay.
for each week or month.
Mm-hmm.
Things like mastering a certain number of new words,
Okay.
watching a movie without subtitles,
Yeah.
or having a conversation with a native speaker.
It's about having something concrete to work towards, right? It gives us a sense of direction and purpose.
Exactly.
Mm.
But he also emphasized the importance of being flexible
Okay.
and adjusting those goals as needed.
Right.
Life happens, and sometimes we don't meet our targets, and that's okay.
Yeah.
It's more about the consistent effort and the journey itself.
That makes me think of something else they talked about.
Yeah.
Dealing with setbacks and those moments when you feel like you're not making progress.
Yes,
I
that's
love
a
it.
huge part of the process.
Yeah.
One expert shared that he used to get really discouraged
Yeah.
when he didn't meet his language learning goals.
Yeah.
But then he realized he was putting too much pressure on himself
Right.
to be perfect.
Yeah, we're all guilty of that.
Right.
So how did he change his approach?
He started viewing those setbacks not as failures, but as opportunities to learn and grow.
Okay.
He would ask himself, okay, what didn't work this week? What can I do differently next week? He made it a process of reflection and adjustment rather than self-criticism.
That's so powerful. It's about turning those moments of frustration into fuel for improvement.
Right. And it ties back to that growth mindset we've been talking about. It's about embracing challenges, being kind to ourselves when we stumble,
Right.
and trusting in our ability to learn and improve.
You know, it's interesting how so much of this advice applies not just to language learning,
Right.
but to like learning and growth in general, wouldn't you say?
I completely agree, whether we're learning a new skill,
Right.
starting a new hobby, or just trying to become a better version of ourselves.
Yeah.
Those principles of consistency, intentionality, and a growth mindset are so valuable.
It's like a blueprint for personal development. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from this whole deep dive is that it's okay to not be perfect.
Right.
It's about enjoying the journey, embracing the challenges,
Yeah.
and celebrating those small wins along the way.
Yes. And remembering that learning is a lifelong process. There's no finish line.
Yeah.
Even these language experts who are incredibly skilled
Right.
are still learning, still growing, still finding ways to improve.
It's inspiring, isn't it? It reminds us that we all have the potential to keep learning and growing throughout our lives.
Absolutely. And one of the best ways to nurture that love of learning is to simply get started. Take that first step, no matter how small,
Yeah.
and see where it leads you.
So to wrap up this deep dive on fluency,
Okay.
let's leave our listener with one final thought to ponder.
I'm ready.
Yay.
What inspiring challenge will you leave them with?
Here it is. What's one small but meaningful action you can take today to reignite your passion for language
Yeah.
and take a step, however tiny,
Right.
towards the fluency that you envision?
Beautifully put. It's a reminder that we all have the power to shape our own learning journey,
Yeah.
one step at a time.
And remember, you don't have to do it alone.
Yeah.
There's a whole world of resources and communities out there to support you on your journey.
That's right.
So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep into those languages that fascinate you.
Absolute.
Until next time, happy learning.